and have it available internally inside the Cohen Veterans Network on our intranet and also externally on our YouTube channel, because the idea is this is something we've made available to the general public today, and we're very excited about that. A reminder that everyone will stay on mute for the majority of the hour today, but feel free. You can go ahead and ask questions in the chat throughout, and I think we'll have some time at the end. I'll be able to read those off and we can get questions answered towards the end of the hour. So to get us started, I can tell you that, for sure, the ways that families can communicate around gun violence as they prepare for the back to school transition is of personal and professional interest to all of us. And we are very happy to have Dr. Melissa Brymer with us here today. And you could read Dr. Brymer's credentials on screen. I'll tell you just to drop more. She's been involved with the development of acute interventions, assessment, and educational materials in the area of terrorism, disasters, mass violence, public health emergencies, and school crisis. So Dr. Brymer, thank you very much for joining us today, and we're happy we can share this again inside our network and outside with the public as well. So take it away, and we'll ask questions at the end of you.
Absolutely, and feel free to use the chat to have discussions amongst each other. I think this topic brings out a lot of thoughts and feelings, and so feel free to even just have a dialogue on the chat with each other. So thanks for this honor of being with you today. Just a little bit more about me. I'm at actually the UCLA side. I'm a professional researcher, but I'm also the director of terrorism and disaster programs at the UCLA Duke University National Center for Child Traumatic Stress. If you haven't heard about our network, we are funded by SAMHSA, and our mission is to raise the standard of care and to improve access for all kids who have been impacted by any type of trauma, and also to support their families. So currently, we have 164 centers funded across the country, and we have centers in Guam and in Puerto Rico. And we do actually also specialize in helping military and veteran families in helping with some of the additional traumas that these families are experienced to. So if you have not seen our military and veterans resources, I'll show you how to get to our website in just a little bit. But today's conversation is about mass violence. There's been a lot of incidences recently and in the news, some school shootings. And it's been a topic amongst many parents and caregivers, educators, and even mental health providers. But what's interesting is there's actually no true universal definition for mass violence. So when we try to find out what has been the prevalence of these events, some, depending on the website, they will use different definitions. Some definitions focus on the method of how the crime was committed, such as when guns are used. Some will focus on the motive of the perceived motive of the perpetrator. So then at those times, we'll be hearing about hate crimes or terrorism, and that many times, depending on who did the attack and again, the motive, many times interpersonal violence or gang deaths are not counted in mass violence numbers. And some groups, like the Victims of Crime, will look at eligibility requirements of who should get federal assistance. So it's important when you're looking at the numbers, how they're doing that definition. But one thing that we can all agree on is just the far impact that these mass violence events have in the community that's been impacted, the region, and actually throughout the US and many times globally. I do respond to many school shootings and mass violent events, but we know that when kids are involved, there's a much more emotional toll on our society. So I was the program principal investigator of an NIJ, National Institute of Justice grant, where we examined 10 mass violence events and school shootings. And you're going to see some quotes from some of the qualitative interviews that we did. We interviewed over 200 individuals. Some were bereaved family members, some were in the incidences, first responders, media, coroners, you name it. We all interviewed. And so you're going to see some snapshots of some of the content of these, of what they said to us. I do know that sometimes it's hard to read some of these quotes, but it's important for us to hear directly from those impacted by these events. And so you see here, one leader, when she was finding out about an incident, was saying, I said I needed to know what happened. He said, yeah, I know. He says, it's really bad. And he was struggling. He said, it could be 30. I said, you're kidding. 30 means to me, I knew it was more than adults. It was kids. And there was something especially different and heartbreaking knowing that those missing kids were dead. So I'm thinking now, oh my God, 30 kids. Others talked about when an incident that includes many deaths, that then going to all the funerals just changes everyone in the community. They think about the young lives that were murdered in that school setting and how they were at the beginning of their life and in their career, and just how much this takes a toll. So when we think about and provide behavioral health support to a community that's had a school shooting or mass violent event, we need to not just think about individual interventions, but actually helping the entire community out, because their differential impacts are such widespread. And when I'm thinking about responding to these events, there's not a cookie cutter approach, meaning we do have to take some factors into consideration of how we respond to these events. Things that I consider is, first and foremost, learn about the community. Have they had a previous trauma or a previous gun violence or mass violence event? Was there something coming up that the community or the school was looking forward to? Were there recent changes that have impacted the scenario? Sometimes the holidays can make a difference. Many of you know that Sandy Hook was right before the Christmas holidays, and that was a very difficult time for that community. Parkland was on Valentine's Day and really kind of changed that holiday for that community. We also think about what are some of the distinguishing features of that event, the magnitude of it. Sandy Hook being an elementary school, because of so many young lives that were killed on that day, really had a profound impact for many parents across the country. How many people were exposed to the incident? Were there different groups impacted? We're seeing many of our recent mass violent events being targeted against certain identities, whether it's our LGBTQ communities, Buffalo, which was a direct target against our Black communities, our Asian communities. Thinking about, are there certain identities in groups that are really struggling with some of those safety factors? And how do we think about and integrate cultural rituals and traditions? Although I was the lead advisor to Sandy Hook and helped the Newtown Public Schools create their recovery program, it's been very important to talk to Uvalde that what was done in Newtown can't happen in Uvalde exactly the same way. We need to appreciate the Hispanic traditions and rituals, thinking about some of those community traditions that need to be integrated in. We've been working, for example, in Uvalde with some of the faith-based groups that really have a profound influence with some of the families in supporting them. So really thinking about how we need to adapt, and you'll hear me talk about that throughout. So as we think about kind of when we're talking about how do we support anyone who's been through mass violence, or a school shooting or gun violence, there's a few kind of concepts that I would like to all of us to keep in mind. We sometimes hear in the media that everyone is traumatized by an event. I want to take us back because we tend to know that many people will recover after these events, but there are certain factors that might put some individuals more at risk. So we know, for example, those that had the most direct exposure are going to have more difficulty with their intensity of reactions and also with resolving any symptomatology that they might be having. So anyone that was in life threat, who was injured, who provided first aid. We know that individuals whose loved ones were killed or injured. First responders, we're hearing and seeing lots of data now how our first responders, although they're trained to respond to these events, they too are impacted by these events. And many first responders usually tend to live in the community where these events occur. And they know the individuals, they know the kids who have been tragically killed in these situations. We learned in our work with Virginia Tech that especially college students and kids, when they have prolonged worry about the safety of others, we know that that actually was correlated with higher rates of PTSD. We also need to know that when something happens and it's all over the news, I always check in with those that I know who have experienced a previous trauma. So with Uvalde, when that happened, we were reaching out to our Sandy Hook colleagues, to our Parkland and Chardon to check to see how they were doing. For those that you serve who might have had a recent death, whether it's because of being in active duty, because of COVID, we know that those who have recently experienced a death might be really resonating with what's happening now and might be seeing a resurgence of some of their reactions. We're also finding that individuals with histories of physical or sexual assaults who also experienced a mass violence, they are more likely to have PTSD and depression 1 year post the event. And the other piece that we're truly seeing these days is that those with limited social supports are having more difficulty healing and tend to have higher rates of PTSD than those who have social supports. And so that really does tap into, if we're wanting to make sure that we support people and help to mitigate some of the long-term impacts of these events, how do we really make sure that those that were most impacted have those support tools to help them? We also know that mass violent events can have other secondary adversities. There can be other threats that occur in that community or in that region. We know for some families, they might have financial impacts. They might have to move at home. So when I'm working with individuals, I want to understand what other secondary impacts are going on so that we can make sure that we provide that level of support. Many times when I hear presentations about mass violence or school shootings, there's a real emphasis on the trauma piece. But I'm going to want us to make sure that we also talk about bereavement and grief. Mass violence in and of itself means that there typically is a death of somebody. And what we're seeing is that the pathway for trauma and the pathway for grief isn't the same. So we might talk about that we have treatments for trauma and that people can resolve their trauma. With grief, we don't resolve missing that loved one who has been so important in our lives. We make meaning, we learned how to adjust. But over time, every time there's that anniversary, we're always going to be thinking about that person that's not with us anymore. Where over time, the trauma, once we start to work on those trauma symptoms, those that didn't have the grief, they might not be as affected over the anniversaries as much as those who are bereaved. I also want you to think about that when we're talking about reactions, one of the critical pieces that we think is so important to educate quite early is thinking about the role of trauma and loss reminders. So a trauma reminder is something that makes us think about that day. It actually puts us in that fear again, that worry about our safety, feeling in danger. Many times heart rates go up. So with Uvalde, we really spent a lot of time actually talking about that 4th of July could have been a potential trauma reminder for those kids and staff who were in Robb Elementary School that day. The fireworks, the sounds, being in crowds, not knowing safety areas could really be a trigger. So we actually created a resource for that. It could be after one high school where there was a school shooting, kids talked to me about not wanting to go to an amusement park anymore. And I first thought it was because of screams when you're on one of the rides, but they also told me that being in the most popular rides, there usually are long lines that if you're in the middle of that line, you almost feel trapped. There's nowhere to escape. And that's how they felt during that shooting. And so sometimes a trauma reminder can be a sensation or a feeling. It could be the time of day, when it happened, what I even was wearing. And so it's important for us to identify what these trauma reminders are, because those trauma reminders make us feel like we are unsafe, many times make us feel out of control. And what we want to do is help those that we're working with, that they do have the ability to identify these reminders, help themselves to actually cope with them when they do happen. So many times early on, we identify those trauma reminders. We help them to discriminate that they're not in that unsafe situation right now. And what's those tools that they can utilize to help to calm their bodies down? Do they need support of another adult? Do they need to distract themselves? Do they need to do some mindfulness? All are kind of critical avenues to help to make sure that those that are impacted by a mass violence, we think about tools that they can utilize to help them with their trauma. Loss reminders are those reminders that make us think about that loved one that is no longer with us. It could be the holidays that they used to have an important role in that doing the holiday meal. It could be a song that I heard, in helping again when they identify these reminders, thinking about how we can honor those loved ones, thinking about what kind of supports they need so that they can deal with both the trauma aspects and the loss aspects. We also know that there's so many different psychological reactions, and it's not just PTSD that those who have experienced a mass violence event can experience. One of the most prominent reactions I hear about, and is actually one of the longest lasting, are sleep issues. Many talk to me about having difficulty falling asleep, waking up often. They might express additional nightmares. Some will talk about significant, overwhelming sadness or grief, withdrawal from those social supports that are meaningful from them just because they can't handle those kind of interactions. We know for some kids, there might be academic impacts or irritability or anger issues. So it's important that we identify those psychological reactions that individuals might be having, and also the developmental consequences that might happen. So many of those that I've worked with, youth, have talked to me. I wanted to go into the military, but after my experience, I didn't know if I could be around gunshots any longer. They sometimes have wanted to go into the mental health field because they want to help others. Some have had impaired relationships because they having a difficulty navigating or communicating when they're really struggling. So it's important for us to acknowledge and identify what are some of the developmental consequences that those who have been impacted by mass violence are facing, and making sure that our interventions are supporting that. But mass violence events also taps into those adults that are on the phone on this webinar with me. And we particularly have this belief system that we can protect our kids and that schools are a safe place. And when these events happen, especially at schools, that protective shield is violated and really can bring out a profound impact of guilt and shame that somehow we didn't do what was necessary. And sometimes we have to make sure that we support those feelings, as well as when the social contract is violated. So what I'm talking about is the social contract is that there are institutions that are there to support us, that are there to help make amends for what happened. And when those institutions fail us or don't actually protect us, whether it's the criminal system, our law enforcement policies, governmental policies, those can also impact us. And that does include when some of those that we worked with talked about being discriminated against or experiencing racism when they've also experienced this mass violent event. So we need to make sure that we keep these concepts in mind and identify them and support them when we're doing kind of interventions. But I told you that it's really important for us not to just focus on the grief piece, but also on, the trauma piece, but also focus on grief. And I just feel like this quote really helps to convey that why acknowledging bereavement and grief is so important. There is perhaps no other human experience that is as deeply private while being so openly public as being bereft from the death of a loved one. The course of grief reactions is embedded in our cultural envelope of mourning rituals and support that is further positioned under an umbrella of social recognition of the status of being bereaved. So we do really want to make sure that if we're working with those who've experienced a death due to gun violence or mass violence, that we need to give special attention to the bereaved. Because one thing I am finding in my research is that the bereaved are telling us that many mental health providers and those in the community are avoidant in talking to the bereaved about what their experiences were. So many of them said that no one talked to me about my loved one dying. People avoided me because they were afraid of saying the wrong things. So instead of getting more supports, I got less supports. So this one bereaved parent gave me this quote and said to me, it's not being asked and not being afraid to ask. I think when it comes to grief and loss, people are afraid to go there and ask. I think it honors the family and it honors them more when you do acknowledge and ask and try to work with them on in terms of how to keep them connected, whether it's to the school district or community. It's uncomfortable. It's hard. It's hard for people to go there. There's uncertainty of people, how much emotionality we're going to handle, but it's more upsetting when we don't. And we need to go there. And we need to make sure that we support the bereaved. We also have to appreciate that those who experienced a mass violence event do not get the luxury of grieving privately. They have to, many know their names, they know their situations. And sometimes that also means that we have to help to protect them from negative media or just being bombarded by too many asks for help. I've also learned by doing this work that just because we put them in a group of being bereaved, that doesn't mean they share the same perspective or want the same things. And that we really do have to ask them their perspectives, their needs, and their wants, and not make assumptions, because I've worked with another bereaved family. Many will reassess their social networks because they've been hurt or feel like mistrust of how certain people in their network have handled that situation. And so we'll need to think about, is there others that we can add that can help them navigate and get those supports? And sometimes that may mean helping them connect with other families who have experienced other mass violence, so that there's that support and that hope within that. We also heard from community members that even going to all the funerals and honoring all the dead, there's sometimes we have to help community members with the responsibility and having to navigate. Can they handle going to all the memorial services or support all the community organizations that are created by family members of the bereaved, and helping with those responsibilities as well. So when thinking about bereavement and grief, it's really important to share with folks there's no set timetable. Just because the 1-year anniversary is coming up and we think that there's that one year timeline, we each have our own timeline. And everyone, even in one's family, will have different timelines. That grief can affect our work, our home, our school life, different parts of our lives. And how do we make sure that we navigate each of these impacts? And no two children, no two individuals will grieve in the same way. And that those that have had pre-existing either traumas or pre-existing challenges could impact more so how you're dealing with the current event. So many times I get asked by how can caregivers help those kids who are grieving? Well, there are great tools and resources out there. Sometimes using children's books helps tremendously. It helps to start that conversation. We also know that finding ways to honor the death of, finding ways to honor that loved one who died, making sure that we open up that communication with kids and validate their feelings, address the new fears that might be coming up. They might be worried about the safety of other family members, or worried about the future because of financial constraints. How do we make sure that we help with that? As I've been highlighting, there's no one coping strategy that works in all situations. So we really want to think about how do we make sure that caregivers and kids have a menu of effective coping strategies, and thinking through when and how to use them. Increasing those comforting connections and thinking about those support, whether it's additional teachers or faith-based members or mental health, who are those connections that are helping that family right now, and making sure that there is enough to really help them get through these difficult times. Really making sure that we highlight the surviving, the caregiver role, and that so many times when I'm working with caregivers or parents, I get the question, should I be disciplining my kid because of what they experienced? And kids do best with a predictable environment. Routines are good. And yes, they do need to know that there's a limit to their behaviors. And so effective disciplining is important even in these times. And sometimes we need to reinforce that. We also have to be good communicators, willing to have the conversation with our kids multiple times, checking in with them on how they're doing. And many times I talk to families about, let's not have those conversations right before bedtime, because bedtime is the time to start relaxing our bodies, not having that difficult conversation of sadness and grief. So is there other times in the day to do those check-ins? And making sure that the child is able to be the focus of the mourning process, and not to have it the caregiver dictate the timeline. Depending on how when there has been a unexpected death, that we know that can actually create traumatic grief. And what I mean by traumatic grief is that mourning and bereavement and thinking about our loved ones is normal. But sometimes when there has been a killing of a loved one, the suddenness of it, we could be thinking about how the person died, which prevents us from reminiscing. It prevents us from things that remind us of how they died. And so we, as the Child Trauma Network, has a series of fact sheets, including when there have been a death because of active duty. So for our military parents and caregivers, for our school staff, our mental health providers, youth themselves. You'll see at the bottom our website, nctsn.org, and the traumatic grief resources are all here that you can take a look at, and they're available in multiple languages. But we also need to make sure that our mental health providers are trained in both grief and prolonged grief interventions, that we do have resources that we can give to caregivers to help empower them. One of them that we have is Power of Parenting. This one is on COVID-19, but we have ones that also are for mourning the death of a parent, and making sure that we acknowledge and support surviving siblings when they also have experienced a death. So kind of thinking through how we can provide support, I think of kind of 5 main areas of intervention. So mass violent events make us fearful of our safety. And so safety interventions is one major piece. So we do need to think about, what are the safety concerns, and are there additional adversities because of this event? We need to communicate what's being done in our community or in the school to help address those safety issues, to help with recovery. Making sure that the media are conveying these safety messages, and not just about the imminent threat. And we put in educating others about limiting news exposure, in media literacy and social media safety as well, because we have seen that media and social media can help increase our social support. It can help give us comfort, but there also can be some negative in this. And so one of the things that we saw in my research is that some people will stay up all night watching the news or being on social media, and that they get overly, excessively consumed with the media. When that happens, we know that their distress levels increase and that their functioning, whether it's sleep or interpersonal relationships, can change. So sometimes we have to help to put a limit on that. Some people are seeing the watching this media because they're trying to search for answers. So sometimes having others help them get those answers for them so that they don't have to be overly looking at this can help. Sometimes letting them know that putting a timer or limiting how much they're consuming is important, and having a conversation with our kids in particular. What are they seeing and how are they reacting to that? One of the things that has been one of the most challenging responding to these kind of events is that there are always people that are going to take advantage of this stressed community. And so there are many out there that will say that these events didn't happen, that will question those that were that might be bereaved, or said that they were in life threat. Some might give messaging that's jarring to us, promoting a perpetrator for their actions. And so we need to help those that were impacted in this so that they can navigate these challenging media circumstances. We also know, and I said before, that there's a lot more hate crimes, whether it's against the LGBTQ community, or Asian, Black, Hispanic, anti-Semitic, Islamophobia. All of these hate crimes are increasing. And so it's important for us to, when an event has targeted a certain identity, that we need to really pay a special attention on helping out in these these situations. And we do have a couple of resources to help caregivers with these hate crimes, and needing to think about how do we, first and foremost, as adults, pay attention to our own reactions. Sometimes we have to have discussions ourselves with our support systems before we can have our conversations with the kids about what it meant that our identity was actually the target of this situation. Listening to how our kids are reacting. Are they worried about safety for themselves, or has there been similar types of hate or bullying at school or in their own community that they are worried about? Are there increased safety protocols being in place? For example, after some anti-Semitic events, there has been increased security at synagogues, and helping kids to understand why that is happening. So we need to have those conversations. But we also need to think about, is there any teachable moments of what our family values are and what is important to our family? The pride we have in our culture, in our traditions, and why those are important to us are all things that could actually help that family unit stick together. So we talked about safety, and calming is the second category. We know that mass violence interrupts us, causes lots of distress, as I talked about before. So we really need to be thinking about supporting the bereaved, talking about those trauma and loss reminders, helping with overall reactions. What are types of techniques we can be doing, and making sure it is clear, if I need extra help, where do I get that help? And I do want to make sure that just, especially in the early days, sometimes people are saying, so many people are in distress, doesn't that mean that they're going to have psychopathology or long-term consequences? And I want to make sure that we are clear in the first several weeks after an event like this, there is going to be distress. It is appropriate. But that does not mean that all those that are in distress are going to have psychopathology. We want to help with that distress. Things like psychological first aid, which I will highlight in just a few minutes, will help with that. And also increasing one's social supports in this time, as well as the coping strategies, can make a major difference. So when we're talking about helping youth after mass violence, we have a great resource that talks about helping kids with their feelings of being afraid, or if they do feel unsafe, helping them get back to routines, because it just doesn't happen instantly. Making sure we understand what their reactions are, and also give a little bit of break. Sometimes when youth have been through these types of incidences, even just everyday challenges can feel worse. And then kids start worrying, can they not function anymore? So making sure we give some ease to that we give some space and time to address how their identities might have been impacted. And really, sometimes, especially our teens or young adults, will really want to search for meaning and maybe actually participate in pro-social events or advocacy. For our younger kids, there's some great tools. If any of you have seen, colleagues of mine wrote a book called Once I Was Very, Very Scared. It's in multiple languages. There is PDF versions at piploproductions.com, which are free. If you wanted a hard copy, there is a charge for that. But there is video YouTube productions, and it talks about when I've been through different types of traumas, including when a loved one was killed. Sesame Street has some great resources on grief, on violence, and also for military families. They have a website, and they have some mobile apps that might be helpful to help to navigate young kids with their coping strategies. So let me keep moving forward here. So we talked about safety, we talked about calming, self-efficacy. So self-efficacy is really tapping into making sure that we acknowledge the strengths of those that we're serving, the strengths of those those in the community. As much as possible, we want all stakeholders involved in decision making, and whether it's having town hall, thinking about ways to have days of service or days of kindness can really be helpful. Many have talked about why did Sandy Hook actually create a new building? And one of the things that there was such a long process about what was the best decision, but we actually had focus groups of those that were impacted. And even building of the new building, the architect that was hired, that part of their hiring process of the architect that they were used, they actually had to do focus group with the families of the deceased, with the educators, with the first responders, with members of the community, to talk about the look and feel and what they wanted the school to represent. We could never bring those that were lost that day back, but we could make sure that whatever was put in place was more of a healing process. And that process in of itself of having these painful conversations really was a healing opportunity for the community. So the fourth category is connectedness. There's so much data on there that the stronger the social connections we have, the more that mitigates long-term consequences. So we need to make sure that those social connections are of high quality, that they are supportive and not in reducing some of those negative social influences. We also need to appreciate that when we're talking about connectedness and talking about mass violence, is that at 1 year anniversaries, people are always worried about another event happening. I worry about the increase of suicidality. So when we are thinking about helping a community after these events, we need to make sure that there are suicide prevention protocols in the schools and in the communities. And we need to help kids with helping their have these conversations with their peers. So members of my network put together these peer cards. There's 3 talking about suicide or self-harm with our friends and peers. What are some of the myths? How do I provide this support? It's also there's added discussions about what words to use, knowing the signs, and how to take care of myself after having one of these difficult moments. This resource is being youth are loving it because it's really very clear and easy to the visuals are great for youth, and it's English and in Spanish. And the last category that I wanted to highlight is hope. We always need to help people to, throughout the recovery and healing process, know that there is a path. That path is different for every community. We need to help the youth know that their futures matter, that we care about them. We need to make sure that we spend time with the memorialization, making meaning, and accepting that although their lives have changed, there are things that they can still hold on to, that there is growth from this, and that we need to support them as they create this journey. So we think that creating school-based recovery programs are essential. And that because we know that, as I said before, that these events do impact kids' success in school, that we know there's higher rates of expulsion suspensions, that there can be increased rates of suicide and self-harm, that we see increased days of school absences and reductions of graduation. So really thinking about how do we make sure we support kids in schools, not just in their home area where it impacted, but also thinking about as they get to college or their next steps, making sure that they have a support there too, because some kids may not realize that they need that support while they are in at their home school, and might not realize to afterwards. This young senior really highlighted that it wasn't till her sophomore year that she finally hit bottom, and that she realized that she needed help. But thinking about what are those things that we can help make sure that kids get the support that are needed. So we do think about mapping, as I said, thinking about those dose of exposure, make sure that there's training and education of our educators. We do have a great one-pager of helping educators on what are some reactions kids will have and what are things that they can be doing to support them. Plus, there are evidence-based practices that we can be training our mental health providers in the school systems as well as in the community. Thinking about partnerships with our families, with other institutions and communities to help with the overall supports, and that the supports and services need to be for our students, our staff, and families. We do need to think about how to adapt emergency and safety protocols, as well as thinking about how to handle all the extra issues that come up after mass violence, whether it's how to handle anniversaries, all the temporary memorial materials that are, and sometimes there are criminal investigations that we have to be dealing with and navigating. That academic support that I talked about, making sure that there are additional support staff in the school systems, whether those are permanent substitutes, having additional professional development days so that our educators are cared for. Kids recover better when the adults are doing well. So we do need to make sure that our educators are getting those kind of supports. And thinking about those times of transitions, and with the new academic year, helping kids, if they've been through something, going a day or two early and going just into the school building again and getting acquainted to their rituals and routines can really help make a difference. There are different evidence-based treatments that are out there and available. If you go on our website, the nctsn.org, we do have under trauma treatments a listing of each of these interventions, what are their evidence-based and who they're used for. And we do need to make sure that we have broad-based interventions for all in the community. For those with moderate impact, there are group interventions like cognitive behavioral interventions for trauma in schools, or Bounce Back, which is the earlier version. That's the K through 4th grade version of CBITS. And there are community-based interventions. Many of you might know trauma-focused CBT or trauma grief component therapy. So psychological first aid is one that I had an influence in, and this is an early intervention. We have it for school systems, for faith-based. We have it translated into different languages. I can't get into all the details now, but if you're wanting to learn more about psychological first aid, we actually have a free e-learning course on learn.nctsn.org, and you can get free CE credits. But it really does tap into thinking about how do we make effective engagement with our youth and educators who have been impacted by a trauma, those safety issues, thinking about ways we can stabilize a system or an individual, making sure we gather that information so that we know what types of supports, what basic needs, if they need social supports, that coping strategies that we talked about, and thinking about, is there other referrals or linkages to services that could help them during this time? Skills for Psychological Recovery is really another community-based intervention that can be used for paraprofessionals. It can be in community settings, our Boys and Girls Club, even libraries, community settings, our faith-based communities, our healthcare institutions. It's a skills building intervention that if I have one time with somebody, how do I make sure I make the most of that time? Again, you can learn about NCTSN. All of our manuals are on our website, as well as there's a free e-learning course right next to the PFA online. Again, you can get CEs, and it highlights how do we, again, gather that information, but thinking about what types of skills are most needed after mass violence, helping with effective problem solve for all the adversities that they're experiencing, thinking about wellness and positive activities and making sure that people are okay with doing those things that create joy and laugh, helping with those distressing reactions we talked about, making sure that our social connections are staying healthy. And sometimes we do need to be tapping into, or our thoughts keeping us negative and not helping us on our road to healing. It's important that we think about what are those barriers that keep people from going into services. And we in our interviews, we heard so many individuals saying, I wasn't the one that was worst off, so others should, I didn't want to take a place of somebody who really needed it. We need to make sure that we have services for everyone who needs it. We need to increase our timetable. We heard from so many in so many different communities that 7, 8, 10 years later, people are still coming into the door for the first time asking for help, and that we need to make sure that we have those supports available, and that we make sure we actually explain why these services are needed and help them to understand why they're having some of the reactions that they're having. I just, as I'm starting to wrap up, we know that preparedness is important and that we do need to have conversations with our kids if they are worried about some of the recent events, what they can do and what schools are doing for school emergency. So being aware of your school emergency plans. Why school active intruder drills are important. Not all drills are the same. And you can see on our website that we've really talked through that drills should be announced, that we should make sure that we help kids beforehand who might have had trauma histories to get support on how to cope with them, or even just navigating. And we do not, when I'm talking about a drill, I'm not talking about an active simulation where police presence are involved. We don't need to create additional traumas to our kids, but we do need them to know if there is an emergency that there are actions they can do to keep them safe. So as we end, I just want us to take for a moment that we created this new self-care resource called PRN. So as we think about self-care and PRN for our wellness to promote our own wellness, I want us to think about and take 3 breaths right now. 1 breath in is take a breath on how is our bodies feeling right now? Where are we holding our attention? The second breath, what's happening in our minds? Is it feeling cluttered? And that third, is it full of worries? And that third breath is naming and noticing our intense feelings. Reset is how do we, between meetings, going from this training to maybe seeing a client or attending to our kids, how do we make sure that we feel steady, that we're more confident, that we can focus? What are those actions that we need to be doing? It could be spending a moment and petting an animal if we're home, going outside and taking a breath, having a cup of coffee, sharing gratitude to a colleague, talking to a friend. And that nourishes really thinking about how do we make sure that we replenish and nourish ourselves. So making sure that we have meaningful moments, that we find playfulness, lightheartedness, joy, that we celebrate our successes, and that we take care of ourselves in this. And I'll make sure that these PowerPoints are available to you, but the resources I'm talking about, there are some great apps out there that many of you might be interested in. Headspace, Liberate Meditation. The National Mass Violence Victimization Resource Center has an app called Transcend. It is for survivors of mass violence, and they also have a website that is available that has a lot of great resources for victims of crime, for survivors, for mental health providers. Other resources, we should all be aware of the crime victim boards and what is available in our states. Each state has different, so going to your crime victims compensation boards and getting familiarized with what's available in your state. For those who have been a victim of a crime, Victim Connect actually helps us to identify what our rights are. If I'm just needing support after any of these events, Disaster Distress Helpline is always available. Some of us just want to sometimes donate after big events. Sometimes fraudulent funds are created after these big events. The National Compassion Fund is trying to prevent that, and they are made up of board members who are family members who have been through other mass violent events. And then we have Voices Center for Resilience, which was created after 9/11, and they have wonderful resources as well. So if you're wanting nctsn.org, learn, or if you're just wanting any of our info, go to just type in info@nctsn and sign up for any of our updates. I'm sorry I went a minute or so over, but I'm happy also to stay on if there are any questions. So thanks everybody for your time today.
And thank you, Dr. Brymer. That was fantastic. We really appreciate your time. We are over time, but as Dr. Brymer said, if anyone wants to ask a question, feel free in the next minute or so. But again, thank you very much. We have the recording. We will share it both inside and outside of the network and get more out of this going forward for sure.
And I'm happy to send a resource list. And if you want to put that on your next to the presentation, you guys can just give me a half day to put them all in one place, and then you can have those. And everyone, I'll make sure all the links for all those resources are available.
That sounds perfect. Thank you so much. That'll be great. All right. Thanks everyone for joining. We'll see you next time.
Thanks everyone. Don't forget your PRN for wellness.